Tanu Rabbanan Mitzvas Ner Chanukah. We're going to look again, section at section, what the Gemara says, because we're starting to resolve and answer the questions that we had according to what the Gemara was talking about. So a few of the things that we said, we spoke about how the Gemara tells us that we're supposed to light Hanukkah lights at sunset. It says until the traffic in the marketplace ceases. So what is that supposed to mean, the traffic in the marketplace? So it says there were these people called the Tamardai, and they were the wood sellers. Once people had to go home, say, oh, do we have enough wood for tonight? If they didn't, they'd come back to get the wood. So once they left the marketplace, that was like, that's it. The day is over now, definitely. Up until that point, that's the time frame. Sunset until the traffic in the marketplace ceases, until the feet of the Tamardai cease. So we'll see. No, we should get to that today to address the deeper significance of that. Then we also have the whole thing about, officially the mitzvah is to have one candle per household for Hanukkah. Well, if you want to do even more than that, then multiple people could be lighting a candle. But if you want to do the Mahadran, Mina Mahadran, like the highest way of doing the mitzvah, Beis Hillel says, the house of Hillel, the study hall of Hillel would say that you have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And the house of Shammai would say 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. As in, we're not just going to do one candle per household, one candle per person, but there's going to be an 8 in there somewhere. Either we're going to get to 8 or we're going to start with 8. We see that we have a disagreement there. And they have two different opinions of why it's like this. The thing that's kind of important about this disagreement is they don't actually disagree with the reasoning of the other. They just disagree with the way the practice comes about. They don't actually disagree with the reasoning. Because Hillel says we have to go up in holiness. We always add to holiness. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And Beis Shammai says that the reason why we do 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is because the bowls of Sukkot, the sacrifices they would give, they started out with a number and they went down. Altogether, out to 70 nations. That's why we do that. They're not contradicting each other as far as the reasoning is. The contradiction only comes in what the actual practice looks like, which means that both of them, their reasoning is correct. They're not saying, oh, no, this isn't the right thought process. This isn't the right approach. They're not even saying that. They're just saying in practice, we should be going up and not going down. That's kind of why we come to that now we light the Hanukkah menorah 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We had more parts of the Gemara we're supposed to put it in the window outside the house, or at least in the window where people can see it, because the whole mitzvah of Hanukkah is to publicize the miracle that was done for us. Look at how God made us victorious, and we had the lights of the menorah. The one light lasted for 8, etc. And then the Gemara tells us, why do we celebrate Hanukkah? What's the mitzvah of Hanukkah? The question is, my Hanukkah. That's because there were the Greeks, and they came, and they tried to defeat us, and we overcame them. And then they went into the sanctuary, they went to the Beis HaMikdash, and everything was a mess there. There was chaos everywhere. And what they found is that the oil was defiled. It doesn't say that the oil was smashed to bits. It says they defiled them. So they took away the seal of the high priest from them, and they made them unholy. So the oil was still there. It wasn't oil that could be used for lighting the menorah. They had the pure olive oil that had to be used. So they found the small cruse that still had the seal of the Kohen Gadol on it, the seal of the high priest, and they lit the menorah, and from 1 was 8, and that's why we celebrate Hanukkah. That's all the things. We had a couple of questions that went to that, and we've answered a lot of these questions so far. Why do we have the connection between Hanukkah and the bowls of Sukkot? So we say Hanukkah is 8 days, and Sukkot is 8 days. So there must be a connection, there must be something going on between Hanukkah and Sukkot, that they're both 8-day holidays, and that's manifest in this world in these 8-day holidays. So there has to be something that connects them. That's one question we have, like what connects Hanukkah and the bowls of Sukkot? The other question we have is that if we're celebrating the mitzvah of the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash had 7 lamps, not 8. So why do we have 8? Then we want to know what is the connection between Hanukkah and the bowls of Sukkot, as in these are not services that seem to align. One's lighting the menorah, one's sacrifices. It's not just that, the sacrifices have ceased. When the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, we don't have sacrifices anymore. Without a Beis HaMikdash, there's no sacrifices. The menorah, we don't have the menorah of the Beis HaMikdash, but we're still lighting the menorah. It's an eternal, enduring service. The lights are never going to go out. So what connection is there between the two of them? They seem to be totally different things. And the last one we have is the Hanukkah menorah is lit at sunset, but the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash was lit earlier than that. It was lit late afternoon. So again, like we're trying to commemorate the miracle with the menorah, and then we're like not even doing the same thing. The only thing that's similar is that we're lighting something. It seems not to connect. Now, the one thing that we have, that we answered from the outset, is that the point of the Hanukkah, like the purpose of the Hanukkah lights, is to illuminate the darkness. In general sense, we can understand then why we wait for sunset, the darkness of the day. So that's why we're going to light the menorah, because we're ushering in spiritual light, and we're going to light up the darkness. So that kind of makes sense. But now, deeper part of it, we went into the whole thing about what's so important about the Greeks defiling the oil of all things. Why didn't talk about the way they smash things up? Why didn't they smash up the oil? Because the whole thing is that oil represents separateness. You can mix oil with a liquid and it's going to separate. And that's what they were trying to do, to cut ahead. What they were trying to do is they wanted to separate godliness, divinity, from the Torah, from Torah mitzvahs. They didn't have a problem with the Jewish people as a people. It's not like Haman who wanted to destroy the people. Haman didn't care how practicing someone was. Talk about the miracle of Purim, that was much more of a physical holiday. We're celebrating the fact that our bodies were saved, which a lot of the mitzvahs are very physical mitzvahs. We're eating, we're drinking, we're celebrating, etc. The mitzvah of Hanukkah was not like that. It wasn't our physical bodies that were endangered, because if a Jew would become Hellenized, if they would start living like Greeks, they were not bothered as far as the Greeks were concerned. What the Greeks wanted to do was remove divinity from Judaism. They wanted to take out godliness, because as far as the Torah is concerned, We like the book. We appreciate this literature that you have going on. But all this stuff you're talking about, that God is the underlying feature of the literature, no. That we couldn't have. That they want to get rid of. Which is why the whole miracle of Chanukah is not a physical miracle. Sure, we have the victory of the war. There's a physical victory that occurred. But we're lighting the menorah to commemorate the one that became 8. We could do anything to celebrate a victory. We don't have to light a menorah to celebrate the war victory. We could have fireworks. But we're lighting a menorah because there's a much deeper spiritual element that's going on here. They were not just fighting this physical war. They were fighting for spirituality. They were fighting for keeping God in Judaism, keeping God within religion. Which is why we also went through that whole thing of there are mitzvahs that we seem to understand. There are mitzvahs that we definitely don't understand. Kosher, shatnez, the mixture of wool and linen, we don't understand those mitzvahs. Who cares if I mix wool and linen? But God says don't. Okay, so I don't, but whatever. Right? Like, okay, there's no explanation for it. If you say, oh, they had a hard time with us fulfilling mitzvahs that didn't make sense, okay, whatever. But it went even deeper than that. Even the mitzvahs that did make sense, they had a hard time with. Even the fact that we said, oh, the reason why we're eating matzah on Pesach is because God took us out of Egypt. They're like, yeah, that's all fine and good as like a ritual. But we're saying you're doing this because God said so. Oh, and by the way, also, He took us out of Egypt, etc. This we can't have. So it's really all the Torah mitzvahs that they had a problem with because they wanted to take out divine spirit. They want to take divinity out of all of it. You have it nowadays. People don't call themselves religious. I'm spiritual. Right? What is that supposed to be? I'm spiritual. Right? You get like, I'm a very spiritual person. Okay? You can be called worse things by better people than being called religious. But no one wants to call themselves religious. Ironically, like God forbid someone would admit to believing in God. You know, like, oh, I don't believe in God. Until like something really good happens and they're like, oh, thank God. But people are like, oh, no, I don't believe in God. But I'm very spiritual. What does that mean? What is spiritual if there's no God? People will also, oh, like my soul feels it. But I don't believe in God. Well, then where did your soul come from? What is a soul if there's no God? How can there be anything besides for particles zinging around in the universe if there's nothing above that? So that's what the battle was over. The battle was over the godness, the God factor. That the Jewish people said, it doesn't matter if a mitzvah makes sense to me or not. The reasoning for it is irrelevant to the fact that I'm going to fulfill the mitzvah. Because God. And it's not just that. Even the mitzvahs that we think that we understand, that we seem to understand, even that is it's just a fraction of what God's reason is for doing something. The same way that God wanted us to do the mitzvah, God also wanted to give us some level, some tiny fraction level of understanding with the mitzvah. Certain things you could say, oh, give tzedakah. That makes sense because, good for society and we all look out for each other. So this is something that we could appease ourselves with this sort of knowledge. But if we want to be honest with ourselves, we want to tell the truth about ourselves, this mitzvah of tzedakah, saying, oh, all the goodness and it's righteousness, it's not just charity, it's justice to give and God gave you extra so you give to others, or whatever reasoning we have, it's not even it. It's just, this is what God allowed us to have this. But it's infinitesimal compared to God's actual reason for things. They want to get rid of that. They couldn't handle having that. This is what we ended up with last time. That's part of why they tried to defile all the oils. They were trying to reach that level. There's a level of worship of serving God that comes from understanding. It makes sense to serve God because He's one. There's a level of serving God that's, even though it's supra-rational, it still stems from understanding. Because you're like, look, there's a God and He's so great. I don't understand Him. Even that, I serve Him because He's so much greater than I am and because I can't understand Him. It's still a reason for doing things. So the oil is kind of that super rational level, but we see the Greeks, they were able to defile that level also. Because as soon as the rational part is there, however tiny it is, that kernel is, there's a counterpart to it. There's a counter argument to rationality. Even the part that says, my rational explanation is because this is so irrational, like that's why I'm doing it kind of thing. Because God is so much greater, I'm just going to give myself over to Him. There's so much understanding that's not there still, but there is a point of understanding that started the whole thing. Now we go to what happened. How then do we have the miracle of Chanukah? Especially because if the Greeks tainted, they defiled up until that high point, up until that level. They got their grubby little fingers into all of it. So how then can we ensure victory, especially a victory that's going to be a complete victory? This is where we're at now. Because what we're looking at is that there was a level what we call Mesiras Nefesh. Mesiras Nefesh means to sacrifice the self. And the reason why this is considered the highest and ultimate level, this level of self-sacrifice, any example that we have of a Jew dying because he's a Jew, or a Jew dying for Torah mitzvahs, or whatever it is, this is a level that we call Mesiras Nefesh. Now, a person doesn't always have to die to display Mesiras Nefesh, but that's what the ultimate is. Giving up your life for God, to sanctify God's name. And saying, I will never renounce my Judaism sort of thing. This is kind of all the stuff we went through in a lot of chapters 18, 19, 20, whatever of Tanya over there, which we're actually going to see some of it over here. Where it says that everyone has, remember, that inherent love. And that inherent love allows someone to give up their life for God. Now, the thing about it is that giving up your life for God doesn't make sense. As far as, wouldn't God want me to live and fulfill Torah mitzvahs? You could break Shabbos to save a life. So why is it that when it's this big setting or something like that, shouldn't we also have to live to fulfill Torah mitzvahs? Even if for 1 second, we might have to, I'm just going to externally renounce Him. I'm just going to pay lip service, but I don't really renounce Him. But that we say no. That's where the love of Mesiras Nefesh comes in. What's the whole thing about it? Mesiras Nefesh doesn't make sense. There is no rationality to it. It's so super rational, but there's no rational point that it begins at. It's just, there is no other way. That's what Mesiras Nefesh comes from. It's just this deep, deep thing of there is no other option. Maybe you felt that in your life before, where it's, oh, but someone wants to argue with you about a point. You're like, there is no arguing. There is no option here. This is it. There is nothing else. Which as soon as you remove the fact that there's no kernel of rationality, there is nothing then that can actually counter-argue it. Because as long as there's a rationale there, as long as there's some sort of rationality there, there's a potential now for a counter-argument. But if I go beyond even that level to something that makes absolutely no sense, and however you want to try to describe it, but it still doesn't make any sense to engage in this, the entire place that it comes from is just because there is no other option. But what about whatever? No, there is no other option. That's where Mesiras Nefesh comes from. That is what they tapped into to have this ultimate victory over the Greeks. Learning a little bit about where this Mesiras Nefesh comes from, the Maamar kind of mentions it, and then I went to the text to pull it out so we could see much more of it in context. Here we have, this is actually from Tanya, chapter 18, but now you'll see it in text. So it says, in relation to God, that he's beyond intelligence and knowledge, and no thought could grasp him at all. We can't even begin to try to comprehend infinity. God. Infinity is not even, it's not even a substantial enough word. But we know that we're finite, we cannot come close. All men are like fools before him. As it says, this is from, it's quoting Tehillim, I believe. It says, I am foolish and ignorant, I'm as a beast before you, and I'm constantly with you. Meaning, because I approach you as a fool and a beast, i.e. through the rational power of faith, precisely therefore and thereby I'm constantly with you. So what is it saying here? 1 to 1 million, there's a relationship between those two numbers. So even though 1 million is 1 million times 1, but 1 million is made up of 1 million ones. So if you subtract 1 from 1 million, it actually affects the number. You don't have 1 million anymore. You have 999,999. You see that even though it's so vast a difference, there's still a relationship between those two numbers. But when you compare 1 and 1 million to infinity, 1 and 1 million are equally irrelevant before infinity. What's infinity minus 1? There's no computation for that. What's infinity minus a million? It's still, there's no computation, like calculator error. Between men, between people, between ourselves, one to another person, we say, oh, that person have greater levels of holiness, that person has reached higher levels of holiness. There seem to be differences in that regard. What we're really doing is we're looking at 1 to 1 million, or 1 to 100, 1 to 10, 1 to 100,000, 1 to 1,000, 1 to 10,000, whatever it is, but these are all comparable numbers. There's relationships between these numbers. However, you could take the greatest of all individuals, and you could take the least of all individuals, quote unquote, the least of all individuals, and you put them before God, and you're just nothing before God. Because God is it. What is your measurement? You can't. What's 1 million to infinity and 1 to infinity? Neither of them have any relationship to infinity. That is why there comes a point, because God's knowledge is so beyond all of us, there comes a point where the only thing we have left is faith. There's the faith that leads to knowledge, and there's the knowledge to faith to knowledge, whatever, but ultimately there's a level of faith. Because once we've maximized our intelligence, we're left with faith. That's all we've got left at that point. Because our brains cannot go. Not just, oh, I'm being whatever. Like, no, the human brain cannot go any farther. Even the smartest person that ever was. Even King Solomon's brain couldn't go any farther. So when it comes to that, we're all like fools before God. As in, it's as if we don't know anything. The smartest person and the least smartest person, it's like we just don't know anything compared to the infinity of God. So the only way we could approach you is with faith. That's why it says, I'm like a fool and a beast before you, that this irrational power of faith, this is the only thing through which I can be with you constantly. Which translation, we're talking about this deep, deep level, this high level of Mesiras Nefesh. We've reached the point that goes beyond the rational mind. There is no rationality that can be introduced to this part over here. So what are we left with? This deep, deep level of faith that goes beyond everything, and there's no reasoning anymore. There's no explanation anymore beyond at that point. Still with Tanya here. Therefore, because we now know this, that we're all like fools before God, and this is something actually very powerful that the Alter Rebbe talks about in Tanya over here, that he introduces in that chapter, but it's just a very powerful point. I feel even the most worthless, I'm going to use quote unquote, even the most worthless of the worthless and the sinners among Israel sacrificed their lives for the sanctity of God's name. They suffer harsh torture rather than deny God's unity. You can see the description that we're using here. We're trying to find, quote unquote, we say worthless, we mean someone who seems to have no spiritual contribution. Even someone without a material contribution. Someone who just seems like a total worthless bum. quote unquote, a worthless bum. Even if they're boors and illiterates who are ignorant of God's greatness, even the little knowledge they have that motivates them, it doesn't compute. Even the little knowledge that they do possess is not what motivates them, for they did not delve into it at all. Someone who is considered the sinner of sinner, this worthless individual, whether or not they might know anything about God, it doesn't matter, because that's not going to be their driving force. They're not tapping into it, they're not using it anyways. So that by no means does their self-sacrifice result from any knowledge or contemplation of God. Rather, they are prepared to sacrifice their lives without any knowledge or reflection, only as though it's absolutely impossible to renounce the one God without any reason or rational argument whatsoever. Basically, what's Tanya saying? If readiness to face martyrdom was intellectually motivated, the benefits and costs would first be carefully weighed. You'd say, oh, there's 1,000 people watching right now. That's going to be an important thing right now. Or, oh, this person is a great rabbi or great leader, so he should sacrifice himself because that's going to make a big statement. We're going to make a martyr out of him. That will be a lesson for all generations. If there was any reason behind martyrdom is Mesiras Nefesh, sacrificing the self. But the decision of self-sacrifice is not based on rational arguments, stemming instead from a non-intellectual resolve that it's simply impossible to do otherwise. There is no other option. Going back for a second, what the Alter Rebbe was pointing out is that even someone who seems to be absolutely worthless, and someone who's a sinner and whatever, even that person can reach a point of Mesiras Nefesh, of this martyrdom, the self-sacrifice. They could reach that point. And it doesn't matter, as it says, they're bored, they're illiterates or whatever. You could say, but they don't understand God's greatness. How can a person who's such a sinner or a worthless, quote-unquote, worthless individual, how can they sacrifice themselves for God if they don't even know who God is? They don't appreciate God. The only thing they know is that they're Jewish. They don't know anything besides that. Or maybe they're brought up more religious and they gave everything up. You could say you don't even know what you're giving up. You don't even know what you're sacrificing yourself for. How can that person then sacrifice themselves? So that's part of what the Alter Rebbe is saying, is because this part of self-sacrifice, it's beyond this level of like, how does this make sense? There is no sense to this. There's a deep, deep part inside every single Jewish person that will lead them toward this, because when that moment comes, there's a fire that bursts out. There's a flame that's going to spark. All of a sudden, the person has this reality where there is no other option but. But he never put on tefillin a day in his life, or he walked out of shul after his bar mitzvah, but like it doesn't matter. Because this is so deeply rooted, and it goes beyond our intellect. Because once it would be in the realm of intellect, we could start fiddling around with it. We could argue ourselves out of things. We could tell ourselves that it doesn't make sense. But it's not even there. It's not even there for us to tell ourselves that it doesn't make sense. It's so beyond that. Why is that? This is so because the one God illuminates and animates the entire soul through being clothed in its faculty of Chachma, which is beyond any graspable knowledge or intelligence. Basically, since the light of the Ein Sof means without end. That is a term that they try to use to describe God, because there is no other term that could describe God. Tell me about God. Well, he's infinite. And, well, that's all I got. Because we can't describe infinity, and that's as far as the human mind can take us. So since the light of the Ein Sof, as in, we're talking about God on this higher level, not the way he looks within creation, is vested in every Jew's soul. Every single person has it within themselves, this light of God. Everyone, regardless of his level of knowledge, is prepared to sacrifice his life for his faith in God. Even a person who's in denial of it. But I think we get the basic point, is that this is something that's inherent within all of us, and it's something that's beyond reason and beyond rationale. So where are we going with that? Here we have Chamesha Shemas Nukir La. There's 5 levels of the soul. So Chamesha Shemas, there's 5 names that say that they're giving to these 5 levels. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Yechida, Chaya. Oh, it's supposed to say Chaya Yechida. Anyways, this goes all the way back to chapter 2 of Tanya. The soul has 5 levels to it. There's 3 that are kind of like the energizing levels. Those levels are inside of us. When we say, oh, you have a soul in you, these 3 levels are in us. Because you have Nefesh, which is kind of our life force, and that animates, that gives life to all of our actions. That's the Nefesh part of the soul. That's what his job is. Then you have the Ruach part of the soul, that gives life to our emotions. That's the battery behind the emotions. Then you have what's called Neshama, which is the life force behind the intellect. These 3 levels of the soul, they're within us. They come into the physical body. Each one powers a different part of the body. One powers the body at all. That's the life force, the action, the nefesh. Then we get a little bit more refined. The emotions are more refined than a physical body. And the intellect is more refined than the emotions. So the intellect is supposed to affect the emotions. Then we have 2 levels that are much higher. And these are the levels that hover above us, because they're too holy to enter into the physical body. So what are those 2 levels? There's a level that's called Chaya. Chaya is a level where it's such a high level, it's a level of the nullification of the self. So that's a place where I could totally submit to God. Tapping into that level, that's what that level can bring me to. Of being able to totally give myself over to God. And then there's a level that goes beyond that, that's called the level of Yechida. Yechida is what's considered the essence of the soul. All these other parts of it are kind of external factors. Yechida is like, who are you? I am my soul, I am whatever, but bringing it all the way to the ultimate point of it would be Yechida. Yechida, we translate, comes from the word of Yachid, which is oneness. So Yechida is the essence of the soul, and that is a level of self-sacrifice. Because that is a level that's so high up It goes beyond anything that the human mind can fully understand. An essence that's so deep inside of you. Going back to the miracle of Chanukah, the miracle of Chanukah occurred when you can say the Maccabees, the people who fought, because the Greeks had defiled everything. They got their sticky fingers on regular rationale. Even the mitzvahs that sort of make sense, the Greeks got their fingers into that. They brought unholy elements into that. Even when it came to the level of something that's super rational, but that's based in rational, so it still has a rational basis, even though you then enter the super rational realm, the level of the oil, they entered that realm too. When you talk about what is the impurities that the Greeks brought into the spiritual realms, that's how deep it went. So how can you overcome that? It went so deep, this impurity that the Greeks try to introduce to try to get rid of the godness. So where do you have to go? You have to go to a level that goes beyond all of that. You have to go to a level that cannot be touched by their sticky, grubby fingers. Where do we find that level? That's the level of Yechida, which is this level of self-sacrifice. So on the one hand, we have the spiritual victory that occurred, tapping into this deep, deep level of it cannot be any other way. That is the self-sacrifice that comes from the deepest, purest level of the soul. That was the spiritual victory that occurred. That the Greeks are trying to remove God from the Torah, and the Jews hung on to it saying there is no other option. God is it. We will not renounce our connection to God. They were able to do it by tapping into the most essential part of themselves, their deepest essence. We have a physical victory also. The way it was portrayed in the physical victory is that you have the Maccabees, their fight to sanctify God's name in a war that they quote unquote had no chance of winning. We know the Maccabees, the army was a weaker army. It was a smaller army. They were not as trained and highly skilled and well supplied, and didn't have the elephants or anything like that the Greek army had. There was a lot of guerrilla warfare going on. It made no sense for them to physically engage in this war. And yet they did this because there was no other option. So in the physical, we see it where they're like, we have to fight. Why are you fighting? Then whatever. No, we have to fight. There's no argument at that point, which is part of why you can't oppose Yechida. You can't get into this argument with Yechida because there is no argument there. This is how it is. There is no other option. What do you mean, but? There is no other option. You know, like when you're dealing with kids, you're trying to say, no, it's bedtime now. And they're like, hey, I'm thirsty. No, it's bedtime now. I'm so thirsty. Okay, I'll give you a little drink. Nah, as soon as you did that now, right? Now you're already lost. There's a power dynamic going on and you just lost in the power dynamic. It's only when you put your foot down and you're like, no. But is that no? But no. When I was at seminary, they showed us, I think it's like an old video. It's called When the Chips Are Down, and it's about education. One of the things the guy talks about is that every time you get a kid a compliment, imagine that you're giving them poker chips. You know, I love your shirt. You just give them 10 poker chips. And then, whatever it is, you criticize them very sharply. What you just did is you took away 15 poker chips. That's how he does that. But the other thing he does is he shows you discipline in class. So he has two parents come up and he says, okay, now you hit her, or whatever. And so he's like, okay, why did you hit her? I mean, whatever. There is no hitting in class. But no, there is no hitting in class. But there is no hitting in class. And then finally the parent, she just stops. Because there is no option. There is no arguing. As soon as you start to argue, you've now allowed an allowance in of something else, of another option. How does this victory come about? When you say there is no other, maybe we could compromise. There is no other, maybe whatever. There is no other option. You can't argue with that. There is no opposing that. As soon as you're like, well, maybe, it doesn't matter what you decide in the end. Because as soon as you're like, oh, well, maybe, as soon as we'll engage in the discussion, you've already shown a weakness. You've already shown an opening. And as soon as there's an opening, whether or not you win in the end, you know what it is also? It's like they describe when the Jewish people came out of Egypt, everyone was afraid of them. For the first time in history, you have an entire slave population marched out of one of the mightiest empires. They marched out in broad daylight. And then aside from all the stories of the plague, they were scared. They were a little bit afraid of that because they're like, oh, let's not mess with these people. Let them go. Go to the land. What happened? You have this nation called Amalek, descendants of Esav, and what they do, they attack the Jewish people. But they lost. And yet they attack the Jewish people. When the water's hot and someone sticks their foot in, they're like, oh, it's not so hot. It might still be hot, but as soon as someone else puts their toe in, then all of a sudden they make it not hot anymore for everybody else. Which is why God, there's an everlasting commandment to get rid of Amalek. There is no mercy for them. Because you, quote unquote, you cool down the waters for everybody else. Doesn't matter that they lost the war. As soon as you show that, no, they are touchable. That's it. The spell is broken. And now you've opened up the door for somebody else to mess with the people. But that kind of, again, here, there is no other option. That's it. You put your foot down, there is no other option. So the physical victory, when the Maccabees stood up and they said, there is no other option, we got to fight this war, that then inspires the entire generation to this level of sanctifying God's name by being willing to give themselves up for God's name. That is how they could have the complete victory. This victory of Mesiras Nefesh is considered a complete victory because you can fight someone. Oh, we'll live to fight another day, you know? Well, then you didn't fully defeat them. We win the battle, but we didn't win the war. Unless it's a complete victory, you won the battle, but you didn't win the war because there's always an option to fight another day. But a victory that comes from this level of Yechida, from the deep essence, is considered an absolute victory. Why? Because of what we just said. There is no opposition. There is no other option when it comes to these things. Not just that, but this level of the essence, because it's the absolute essence, it permeates and it goes out to all the other levels, all the way down to action. So you see, when we look at like the 5 levels, let's say, action, So you say, oh, we had a victory on the level of action. Well, what about the other 4 levels? Those levels are higher than action, so that victory doesn't necessarily reach the higher realms because it's the victory on the lower realm. But because Yechida, the essence, is the ultimate level, a victory there is a victory that affects all the other levels. Which is why there's a thing about essence that on the one hand, it transcends everything, but at the same time, it's still part of everything. So you can say, oh, where's your soul? Your soul gives you life. That's the general life force that you have. But here I have a separate functioning when I move my hand, or when I blink my eyes, when I shake my head. These are all separate functionings. But what powers all of them is the soul. So even though I don't necessarily see general life force in the fingers, I see fingers moving. Where's the general life force? The general life force is still there. The comparison to oil is that oil is something that separates, yet it saturates, it gets into everything. It permeates through everything. Just to kind of wrap up with this whole thing, we have this verse comes from the Torah. It's in Bereshit when Hashem is talking to Yitzchak. God's talking to Isaac and he's telling him all these different things about the covenant that I had with your father is going to continue with you and blessing. The phrase that's used is Ekev Asher Shema Avram B'Koli, because Avram listened to my voice. So if you look, that first word, Ekev, if you change the vowels of it, you have the word akev, which is the word of heel. As in, Avraham was so consumed with, and the will of God so much permeated him that even the heel, the lowest part of the body, even his heel listened to God's voice. That's how much he was engulfed in the service of God, that even down to his heel, listened to his voice. Which, file the thought, we're going to get back to the heels. Which we kind of said this, but this is what we have here. If you guys remember chapter 6 of Tanya, chapter 6 of Tanya is when we first started speaking about the animal natural soul. And one of the rules that we have for it is Zel Umazev, this opposite this. So everything that happens in the holiness, there's a mirror image, like a counterpart for it in the not holiness. The same way that the divine soul, the godly soul, has 10 soul faculties. It has the 3 intellectual and 7 emotive. The animal soul has the same thing. They have the same capacities. All of these things, they all have a counterpart to each other. All the things of holiness has a counterpart in the physical world. Not specifically holy world is a counterpart for it. The only thing that there's no counterpart for is Yechida, which is the essence. There is no counterpart when it comes to the absolute essence of a person. Which is, again, why this victory is so complete. Because we've left the realm. We're not even talking about winning battles and winning war anymore. We're going way deeper than all of that. We're going way beyond all of that. And the level that we're fighting at now is a level that's going to be so complete. To the point even that this level of Yechida, because this victory of this essence is so complete, it even affects, what we'd say, the animal soul, the natural soul. And it's something that even it transformed the physical world. What we'll get to, just to sum it up so you have like a line of walking away with, is that it's not just a light that illuminates the darkness, but it's a light that transforms the darkness into light as well. Which, in summation, the punchline of all this is part of what the miracle of Chanukah was and is for all times. It's not just bringing light onto the darkness, but transforming the darkness into a light itself. That's where we end with here.